everyone. We're going to be learning about mussels today, which this is a mussel shell. So we're going to be learning about mussels and also learning about why they're livers rivers, which is written in the background of the picture that I have here of a mussel that I've studied. So it's going to be really cool. I really like mussels, and let's have some fun learning about mussels. So mussels are benthic dwelling organisms, meaning that they live on the bottom of their water body. And so like the animated GIF is showing, we have these mussels here, and they're at the bottom of the river. They also live at the bottom. They'll be at the bottom with like rocks and stuff. And so sometimes if you're walking across and you walk on something that feels like a rock, it could also be a mussel, because mussels do feel similar to the rocks on the river bottom. And mussels have a soft part of their body called their tissue, and their tissue, which is illustrated over here, it contains their muscular foot that they use for movement, so they can actually kind of be able to move a little bit. They have a mantle which surrounds the shell interior and also helps build their shell. They have anterior and posterior adductors which help open and close the shell, so this way when they're on the bottom of the river, they'll still be able to open and close their shell. And they have labial palps and gills, which help them for filtering. And their mussel shell is composed of a left valve and a right valve. So they have a left valve, right valve, and that's kind of why they can also be known as bivalves, because they have two valves. And they're composed of 3 different layers. So they have a periostracum layer, which is composed of organic material. And then they have a prismatic layer and an inner layer, which is composed of calcium carbonate. And fun fact, calcium carbonate is what composes up limestone. So mussel shells are made out of the same material that makes up limestone. And over here is a thin section of a mussel shell. So what we can do is we can actually cut up the shell. So we can cut this up into thin slices and make thin sections out of them and analyze mussel shells by their thin section. And mussels are commonly known as livers for rivers, and they're commonly known as livers for rivers because they will take in pollutants out of a water body and will instead accumulate them in their tissue and shell as they grow over time. And that's very similar to what human livers do for our blood. Human livers will filter our blood and remove out toxins. And so mussels are known as livers for rivers. And also, did you know that mussels can filter up to 15 gallons of water per day? And this is for adult mussels. So a mussel, which is smaller than like the size of my hand, can filter 15 gallons of water. And 15 gallons of water is equivalent to 125 pounds, which is around 56.6 kilograms. And so the amount of water that mussels can filter is about equivalent to the weight of a mule deer or to Hector's dolphin. So a little fun fact about how much water a mussel can filter every single day. And then mussels are easily threatened due to habitat loss, silt pollution, ammonia, impoundments, runoff. Any of those can sort of cause a mussel die-off. And if you have a mussel die-off in your water system, then that generally indicates that your water system is not as healthy as it could be. And mussels are very particular to their environment. So like we said before, they're very sensitive to pollution changes. They're very sensitive to environmental changes in general, which makes them really good bioindicators of river health. And when we say bioindicator, we just mean that they are a biological organism that can indicate whether your water system is healthy or not. So if you have a mussel die-off, your water system is not healthy. If you're not having a mussel die-off, then your water system is probably relatively okay. And so they are very sensitive to water temperature changes. And so mussels in the animated GIF, they prefer 65 degrees Fahrenheit. That is their temperature they like to live at. So if the water is too hot or too cold, they can start to die off or can start be impacted by that. And they're also sensitive to other environmental changes. So you can actually know if your water system is having an environmental change based off of how the mussels are responding. And mussels also take in CO2 to build their shell. So like to form the calcium carbonate of their shell, they will take in CO2 to help build it. However, if you have too much CO2 in your water system, that leads to acidification, which breaks down their shell and causes it to become brittle and fall apart. And that is illustrated in these videos here. So I added in 10% HCl 2 mussel shells to see what would happen, because 10% HCl is going to be equivalent to our acidification of a water system. And so if we drop in the HCl, it's not acidifying or reacting with the organic layer, so the periostracum layer, nothing's happening because it's not reacting. But once it reaches on the calcium carbonate, we see it start to effervesce, so it's bubbling and reacting, and it's breaking apart that calcium carbonate. And we can do it on the inner layer of the shell as well. So if we put in HCl onto the calcium carbonate layer of the mussel shell, it's going to start reacting and breaking down the shell and eating away at that calcium carbonate layer. And this image over here, video that we're going to play next, you can sort of see the outline of that 10% HCl addition. So we actually did remove out part of the calcium carbonate, and we can do it again and do it even more. And so it's still going to eat away at it, but each time we're eating away at it, we're making the shell more brittle because we're breaking the shell down. And so eventually what would happen is the shell would become really brittle in that one specific spot and would break down and could fall apart. And so just to kind of summarize what we just went through is mussels are filter feeders, so they'll filter out pollutants and release nutrients, which earn them the name livers for rivers. And water systems with mussels are generally healthier than those without. Pollutants and impoundments cause mussels to get sick, and in some cases they will die. And a mussel die-off means your water system is not as healthy as it could be. And in general, freshwater mussels are very sensitive to changes in their environment, such as water temperature increase. And mussels help combat climate change. Their shells are composed of calcium carbonate, and mussels will take in CO2 to help build their shell. However, if you do have too much CO2 in your water system, then that leads to water acidification, which will break down their shell, and we don't want that happening to mussels because that will also start causing them to at least die off or get sick, which will then cause them to start dying off. And the last thing that we're going to talk about with mussels is, did you know that mussel shells are similar to tree rings? And this is something I find really cool about mussels. And so this is an up close. So this is 100 microns. So we have really zoomed in on a mussel shell. So like the thin section of the mussel shell that I had shown previously, this is kind of what we're zooming into. And what we can do is do laser ablation. And so when I say laser ablation, what we're doing is we're kind of shooting this laser at the mussel shell, and we're doing ICP-MS with it. So LA ICP-MS, which is laser ablation, ICP-MS. And what we're doing is breaking up part of the mussel shell. It's sending the dust aerosols into a detector for the ICP-MS, which will tell us in general how much of one element do we have in relation to calcium, because we tend to use calcium because calcium carbonate, and it can tell us how much of that we have in relation to calcium, which we can then use to ratio and figure out and track like changes over time. And so these were the laser ablation spots that I had done on one mussel shell, and this is an example of laser ablation. So that dot here is our laser ablating that one spot on the mussel shell, and then we went through, did it on each of these layers. And so that can allow us to, in my particular case, track metals over time. So depending on how long the mussel was alive, so if the mussel was alive for like 14 years, I could see how metal trends changed over that 14-year time period. It can also let us look at flood and drought conditions by looking at specific isotopes. We can see, like, was there a flood during this time period, or was there drought-like conditions? And it can also allow us to track seasonal changes as well. So mussels have growth layers, and within those growth layers, they have seasonal layers. So we can look at winter and summer conditions in a particular year that has been tracked by this mussel shell. And we can also look at ages, so we can date the mussels and figure out how old they are based off of isotopes that we can analyze in each of their growth layers. And so we can also do this with, if we have like historic mussels, we can look and go even farther back. So the older the mussel is, the more information we can get by doing laser ablation of their growth layers, which I think is really cool. And so that's kind of how they're similar to tree rings, is with tree rings you can track over time as well. So mussels are cool. And that's that. And then the last thing I want to show is that, well, actually, I won't show that. I'm just gonna end the meeting.